Today's episode features Anna Long. Anna is a land use attorney with Dean Mead law firm. Today's conversation with Anna focuses on land use changes within the state of Florida, that process, best practices for landowners and real estate advisors, as well as developers. What can they do well when working projects through local and municipal governments in Florida? So we hope you enjoy today's conversation with Anna.
In Our Expert Opinion podcast is brought to you by SVN Saunders Real Estate, a full-service land and commercial brokerage with over $4 billion in transactions since 1996.
Good morning and welcome to another episode of In Our Expert Opinion podcast. My name's Tyler Davis. I'm the president of SVN Saunders Ralston Dantzler, which is a leading land and commercial real estate firm throughout the Southeast. Today I'm joined by Anna Long. Anna is a land use attorney with Dean Mead law firm in Orlando. Welcome, Anna.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Anna. So how did you get into land use in general? We'll get a little bit more into some of the state-specific stuff and impacts across the Southeast of land use issues and zoning challenges. But how did you get into land use? Is this something you knew you wanted to do when you were a kid? You wanted to go to law school and then eventually get into land use? So tell me a little bit about your background.
I got into land use as working for law firms and doing environmental law. So a lot of what's in Florida involves land development, and whether there's an environmental issue associated with it that needs to be resolved or a permitting issue that needs to be resolved, land use and environmental regulations on occasion and more often than not kind of go hand in hand with each other. So I had the expertise in the one area and kind of morphed into the other as well.
Well, I feel like they probably go hand in hand in a lot of ways.
Yes,
correct?
They do.
So that's more focused on brownfield, phase one,
correct.
Environmental oil spills, issues like that.
Yeah, and permitting, stormwater permitting, environmental resource permitting. All of those things are associated with a property when the property is being developed or as brownfields redeveloped.
Okay, interesting. That is a great background and context to have, because so many of our land use issues and challenges and development projects we have certain environmental hurdles attached to them, whether they've been because of agriculture uses in the past or other things, railroads, junkyards, things like that. So that's great context. For us as real estate professionals and land use or land brokers, a common situation where we need the services of a land use attorney, or we have a client who owns a large tract of land. Maybe that land has been in the family's in the family's ownership for decades, and they finally get to the point where they want to sell it. They're not totally sure what they have. It's been cattle or citrus or some type of ag use for decades. And at what point does it make sense for them to bring in a land use attorney? Should they bring in somebody 5 years or a couple years before they want to actually go under contract to sell that land to help them get it entitled, to get zoning, land use in place? Or does it make more sense for them to contract with somebody, even though there's some unknowns, to go under contract with a developer or a builder and let them kind of take it through that process? What do you see is the most common scenario? What's the best scenario? What type of advice would you have for us as land use, as land brokers, and also for our landowners out there?
Well, I think the answer is it depends. It depends on what your landowner expects from the deal, time-wise, cost-wise, etc. It also depends on how savvy your landowner is and their kind of barometer, if you will, for frustration, because getting entitlements is not always an easy process. So the combination of those things would then result in, well, let's wait, or let's do something now. Let's see what we can get going. Certainly, properties that are entitled are generally, not always, but generally higher valued properties. But then the question becomes, well, what if I'm getting it entitled for, let's say, a residential subdivision, and the only person that's interested in it wants to put a warehouse there? Right. So have I entitled it incorrectly, and I'm still going to have to wait till that change takes place?
Right.
So again, it depends. It depends on how much information the buyer has, what's going on around the properties. the timing of the expectation of change.
Right. And I feel like all those factors come to play sometimes on these agriculture or transitional land pieces, because sometimes the landowner doesn't want to be the first domino to fall or
Yeah.
the first family to around their neighbors to sell for development, even though it's going to happen at some point. It's just a matter of when, not if. And so, I feel like a lot of people just by default kind of put their head in the sand and say, okay, I'll let the developer go be the bad guy and get it under contract and then go get permits. But to your point, it depends, right? It's like a lot of things. I'm sure you have great examples of people who've done this well and sold something off that was entitled, and other horror story type instances where they did something
Oh,
wrong.
sure. And also the team. You want to put together a really good team. So you want to make sure that it's not just a land use attorney that you're involving. You want to involve a good engineering firm, certainly one that has a planning aspect to it, because in order to seek out the best use for that property, if it's not going to be ag, then having somebody familiar with the local government and the local planning boards and what's going on around the community in which you're trying to entitle the property to something other than what it's currently entitled. Having that type of a group together to walk it through and to provide sufficient information to the jurisdiction for them to look for a way to get on board with your ask is certainly the best approach when you're doing something like this.
Right. What are some of those hurdles that you see at a local municipal level being common, or is it utility availability, running utilities to some of these sites? Is it school concurrency and a lack of seats in schools that are available? Is it traffic? Is it road improvements? What are some of the bigger hurdles and things that when you're working something through the entitlement process, or the big hurdles that a developer or a landowner would have to get over?
So I want to say yes, all those things. But I think the biggest hurdle is the community buy-in. I think oftentimes agricultural land, it's rural in nature, and the folks that live in and around the property that is subject of a land use change, they've gotten used to the greenery, they've gotten used to the rural lifestyle, they've gotten used to the semi-improved roads, they've gotten used to quiet, they've gotten used to no traffic, and if you're going to turn what was fields into a 350 unit subdivision, that will change things. And they are most often the greatest impediment to any sort of land use change.
Yeah, and I can see things from multiple sides here. I'm typically, at our firm, we represent farmers, landowners. We do a lot of conservation work, but we also do some development work as well. So oftentimes we're on the side of cheering for a development to get approved. Whereas, when I take a step back and I do put myself in the shoes of the neighbor or somebody who's lived on their farm for 70 years next door to this, I do get the pushback. And I think, that's a challenge to a lot of approvals, are the pressure that neighbors can put on a zoning board, a planning committee, a county commission for that approval. What are some things that you see developers doing to help get buy-in from neighbors? Are there things, or a landowner going through a land use change process? Are there any best practices that you've seen people go to help get buy-in, or at least help get people to understand what is going in?
Well, I don't think you will ever get 100% buy-in, and there will always be a group of whomevers that don't want to see change. So I think the best you can do is work very closely with staff. That would be a problem to start with. So working with staff and figuring out what they can support, what they would recommend. They often know more than you do, and they've helped get through successfully changes and have fallen on the sword when things don't go the right way. But they certainly, in most cases, have an understanding of what was and understand kind of the flavor of the day on the boards to know whether or not they're going to be in favor of the recommendation to change the zoning, change the underlying land use or not. It's often at that stage when you're working in pre-application meetings that you get feedback that says, if you guys, instead of 350, if you would just be willing to go 300 or 299, just sounds a whole lot better. And then, of course, then the developer has to figure out whether that's something that the market will bear and that the
and
cost
whether
of
it pencils out for
that's
their deal
right.
that
That's
have,
right.
they're pursuing. Yeah.
But definitely a good relationship with the staff, an understanding of what specific district within a particular jurisdiction the property lies, and is that commissioner or council person pro-development, not pro-development. You need to know those kinds of things. You need to do your homework.
Yeah, and it seems like if you can get staff buy-in on a lot of these projects, then you have a better chance of getting them pushed through. It seems like a lot of zoning boards and review committees will obviously look at the staff's recommendation, and also staff are the first people that get calls from landowners when those mailers go out within 500 feet or whatever of the property. Is that when you work on a land use case or a client comes to you, what's your first step? Is it to go to the staff board? Do you like to work things kind of from the ground level up within a jurisdiction?
I like to know who's on the team. So I like to know who is your engineer, who's your architect, what have you done already on the property? Has somebody gone out there and done a phase one? Is there a need to do that? What are your plans for the property? If there were no rules and you could do anything you wanted, what would it be? Kind of get a feel for how realistic their vision is versus what they're going to end up with in the best case scenario. And then an attorney really isn't involved necessarily in the pre-app meetings and things like that. That's when the engineers shine. So knowing that the engineers have done a good job, I do like to receive copies of those things, just like I like to give the engineers the things that I write.
Right.
Because sometimes another set of eyes with a different understanding of what they're looking for helps both parties. So collectively as a team, putting together kind of the best story to enable staff, if all things considered are equal, you're giving them a reason to support the position you want to take. You're giving them a reason to support the change you want to make, as opposed to them having to sift through everything and look for a reason. So I think very clearly, without a lot of fluff, you take it in, you ask the questions, they ask, and then be responsive. I think that's critical. It bothers me when a submittal gets a request for additional information and team members are less than enamored with replying because they feel that I've already given them that information. I told them that the first time. Well, if you did, they wouldn't be asking it a second time. And in the end, it's the regulating body that has to give you the go-ahead. So give them what they want. If they ask for it 3 times, give it to them 3 times. I mean,
That's right.
Get through the process.
So you mentioned one thing that I think was interesting. It's kind of the dreams versus reality. And I think that can go both ways, right? It can be on the developer to go in with a plan, or the builder or landowner to go in with a plan that is feasible, that is kind of meets the appetite of that local jurisdiction and those in charge there. But I think it also can go on the side of staff and county commissioners sometimes, or city commissioners, to kind of understand that, hey, not every property is one that Tesla is going to come build a 1,000 person job facility at, right? I think it's sometimes I get frustrated when dealing with some of these projects where a municipality, the heads of it want X, Y, and Z things, but it's not practical from a real estate perspective, or it's not financially feasible for a developer to do this. So I guess, how do these two things sometimes meet in the middle, or what can county staff and those at leadership levels within a jurisdiction do to understand kind of the real estate financial side of some of these transactions, to see what is doable and what isn't? Because sometimes I feel like asks from a developer, they ask too much of a county or city, and then sometimes the city and county ask too much of a developer.
Sometimes it just doesn't work out. I can give you a very recent example that we were before Planning and Zoning Committee requesting a rezoning, and it was for, I think it was 70 townhomes. They were going to be fee simple ownership, so it wasn't rental units. And one of the commissioners was very upset because he wanted affordable housing there. Well, I guess it's not the product that the developer sees there, nor is the market at that particular space good for that use. And as he's saying he wants affordable housing, the constituents who were there in opposition of anything going anywhere are behind me saying, that'll just increase crime. We don't want this and we don't want that. So you have a committee member saying affordable housing. You have other people saying essentially no housing, but if there's got to be housing, certainly not affordable housing.
Put it way out there.
That's right. So it's a balance of all of these different interests and needs and wants, and still recognizing, particularly in the state of Florida, that housing is a need, an absolute need.
It is. And I think you brought up affordability. That is one of the biggest challenges in the state of Florida, and will be for the foreseeable future with population growth and rising insurance costs and other things, is how do we make housing affordable to sustain our job growth and companies wanting to relocate here. Live Local Act was started a couple years ago, enacted. It's goals and objectives are in the right place and heart's in the right place. There's been some challenges on the rollout, like any bill, but what can the state do and local municipalities do from an approval process, whether that's speeding approvals up or approving more housing, higher density housing? What can we do to make sure that housing stays affordable in Florida from a land use and zoning and development standard perspective?
I don't know that I have an answer for that. I think the best we can hope for is that level heads and great minds will get together and make it so. It sounds very lofty. But in all honesty, we're running out of land. Mm-hmm. And there is a need to have planned development. In my opinion, there's also a need to go back and reassess some of the pocketed wetlands that were placed under conservation easement decades ago, because that was the way it was done, and ask, are those wetlands still viable? Does it make sense that those pocketed wetlands, I'm not talking the stretches.
You're talking 10 acres
Yes.
in an urban core.
That's right. Does it make
wetlands.
sense to look at that? Because clearly all of the services are already there.
Right.
It'd be more like an infill project, so that's not going to help vastly. But there's a lot of pocketed areas that to me would make more sense to be looking at, where we've already have development, where we already have services. And there's no move afoot to do that.
Yeah, would there be a way to, those are probably low quality wetlands because they've been had so much development pressure adjacent to them and water spill off and things like that. Is there a way to create a system where maybe we relook at, can we take 10 acres here, but create, kind of a similar to a bank type structure, but we look at some of those more infill type wetlands that are designated within the state and create some type of program where, we make some of that land available, but also create higher quality wetlands elsewhere that are really good habitats for creatures.
Yeah, I think that it has to happen. I think it's wasted land right now.
That's interesting. Yeah, and something to kind of keep in mind, because you're right. We do have a shortage of land in Florida. One of the challenges from an affordability standpoint, I think, is education. It's education around what affordable housing is, what it looks like. You can drive through some of the new affordable projects in Lakeland, affordable housing projects in Lakeland. They don't look like affordable housing. I mean, it's not what most of the public has in mind. You can go look at, some of these higher end affordable projects that are, done by a national developer. And you close your eyes, you look at the outside of that building versus the outside of a market rate apartment complex, and you can't tell the difference. And I think locally there's a lack of education around what affordable housing is and also where it needs to be. And I think, you hit on it a second ago. I think people want affordable housing to not be near them, but the people who need affordable housing need it to be within urban areas because they need to rely on public transit. They need to be close to jobs, which are typically inside cities. And so I think that's a big challenge, is just getting the public educated and getting governments educated on what affordable housing is. And it's not always what people have in mind.
I agree with you. I also think that somebody should look at the available inventory of existing housing in particular multifamily, that isn't the brand new stuff. Because see, that's part of the problem. If I have my choice between the brand new stuff and the old stuff, what am I going to choose? If I could afford both,
You're going to choose the new stuff.
yeah, because it has more amenities and things of that
nicer.
nature. And so a lot of times local government will say, we don't need any more multifamily housing. We have plenty of apartments. Well, a majority of the apartments that they're speaking of are not the apartments that people are looking for.
Right.
So look for a program wherein that it would make sense to the current owner of those properties to get either low interest loans or something. You asked how the government can help to support
Rehab
rehabbing
renovations.
those. Yes, increasing their value, thus increasing their desirability, instead of looking to where's a new place I can build.
Right. And I think the nicer you make kind of the B and C class, 50-year, 30-year-old apartment complexes locally, the more appetite there is for new product. Because I think one of the concerns that, and you can hit on this too, that a lot of county, municipal, city leaders have about housing is that, well, in 30 years, it's not going to be a nice apartment complex.
That's right.
Right. And so I feel like if you can make the older stuff nicer, it kind of brings the bar up and gets people more excited about apartment housing, whether that's affordable or market rate.
Right.
Quickly on one more thought on affordability. I think it ties in some with where we're at as a state. A lot of counties, did 2030 planning. Now they're doing 2050 planning. Orlando's one of them. Polk County starting to relook at some of their land use stuff for the next 20 or 30 years. What changes do you see taking place as part of some of those kind of redrawing land use boundaries from a housing standpoint? Do you see counties and cities saying, okay, we realize we need more housing because it's not affordable. Let's get more, let's be more open to changing some of this? Or do you see it going the opposite way, where it's kind of more of the NIMBY mindset of, hey, we've got enough housing, we've got enough people already because of traffic and schools and things like that? Is there a big picture sense of where you kind of see some of these leading Florida municipalities going over the next, as they kind of plan out some of the next 20 or 30 years from a land use perspective?
I think they're going to continue to look at infill and looking at ways to increase density and intensity in the areas that are already meant for that. I do think that they are, at least in certain municipalities and jurisdictions, there is organized pushback against rural development, although that's pretty much what we have left, right? So it's either do your infill, and then from looking inside out, when I get out so far, I've got to actually give some thought about land use change and zoning change for properties that historically were pasture.
Right.
If indeed the landowner is interested in selling. And there has to be some common sense that you can't keep inviting people into the state to increase your economy, the businesses and such, and then not give them a place to live. It doesn't work that way.
It doesn't. And, I think that is the biggest question facing the state long term, to sustain this level of success with the amount of land that we have owned by the state and in protection and conserved. What do we do with some of this remaining land that is available? How do we be thoughtful about keeping Florida and creating spaces for wildlife to continue to operate and live and thrive? How do we create enough land to sustain our agriculture industry, but also how do we create enough land for people to live and to live affordably? And it's not just people coming from outside of Florida to live here. It's people who, your husband and wife grew up in Florida, you have 2 kids. Well, you want your kids to be able to live close to you in Florida. We've got to have housing that's affordable for young people to live and work and be able to buy a house and raise a family and do all the things that our parents were able to do. And that's a huge issue in Florida moving forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's probably the saddest thing I've heard of late are young adults, my kids' age, 30, 27, who say out loud, I don't think I'll ever own a home. I don't think we'll ever be able to afford a home. And that's, to me, very sad.
It is. Yep. One challenge, I think, from a affordable housing perspective, or housing affordability, I should say, not affordable housing, but is the supply. And that is impacted by everything we've talked about so far, but it's also impacted by the time to get approvals. So I'll just ask the $1,000,000 question. Why does it take so dadgum long for a property, a development property, or a land use change to go through? Why does it take so long for a developer, home builder to get approvals for a project when we do have such a shortage of housing in certain markets?
Well, there's a lot of reasons. It's not always on the government delaying. It's oftentimes that the package that was submitted was incomplete.
So package meaning
The application package to go in for the changes, land use and or zoning or site plan approval, any and all of it. When you don't check off all the boxes and you submit it anyway, it's an incomplete package, period. It goes back to square one, starts all over again. Not having a good relationship with the staff as far as, well, can you explain to me what you mean by number 10? I've never seen that before. Is that looks like a new addition. To ask the questions instead of trying to guess about what the jurisdiction is expecting from you.
Right.
That's why I think the pre-application meetings are crucial. Sending those submittals out to your entire client team so everybody can look to dot an I and cross a T, also critical. I think the more time you spend up front doing the good job, the less time you have to spend on the back end answering things you either misunderstood or missed altogether and delay yet again. And then, of course, there's turnover. Just in the private sector, there's turnover, but in the government sector, for whatever reason, there's been a significant amount of turnover. A lot of people have aged out and have left. Folks coming up don't stay very long. Sometimes they're hopping from one jurisdiction to the next or from public sector to private and back again.
And that's got to be so hard within a city or county when you do have the institutional knowledge on a land use code or development code retire, and then you try to replace them with people that move from city to city to city. You don't get that institutional knowledge of a code or things like that could help facilitate quick answers in a more timely process.
Correct. And also the lack of knowledge and the lack of experience then results in the lack of confidence. So the lack of their ability to give a confident answer, a confident response, one that they'll defend before the governing board versus defend between you and I. So they're going to get up there and the staff that gives the first go round of the requested changes. And if they're not feeling it, it'll come across immediately.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just, everybody in this industry has probably been in situations where projects just take longer to get permits and get approvals and get land use change than they probably should from the outside, but there probably are reasons internally why that happens. We were, just a quick fun story just for how long some of this can take. We were working on a 1 acre land use change. It was in the Green Swamp area of state concern, but it was on Highway 27, an out parcel with 700 residential units and 7 million square feet of industrial between that and the Green Swamp to the west. It took us 18 months to change 1 acre to commercial use, and it was an out parcel. And, that process, I really learned a ton about all the various challenges, and there were some related to an easement, but that process also highlighted just why does some of this take so long? And, I know that there's been changes from and I want you to hit on this a little bit too, but changes from a wetland approvals perspective in Florida between your water management district and the Army Corps. So on some of these projects though that do have challenges, what other reasons are there why it takes so long? Is it process related? Is it education related? I mean, it just seems like if we have a shortage, by the time a project gets approved, you put a property under contract, a developer takes it through the process, then closes, then builds apartments, it can be a 3 or 4 year timeline. And so when we have, until those are ready to be lived in, right? And so it just seems like this lag of approvals in Florida is worse than in other markets where we've done business. And I know there's more environmental and ecological issues in Florida, but big picture, what can we do to speed this up?
Improve relationships before you need them. So calling somebody up either at an engineering firm or at a local jurisdiction, when you're getting ready to submit something isn't as effective as attending various professional functions where you can mix and mingle with those kind of people and just have somebody get to know you. I still am a firm believer of the whole face-to-face thing.
Yep.
It's a lot harder to tell me no when I'm sitting across from you than it is on a phone. It's a lot harder for you to just dismiss me when you've known me. So those are the kinds of things I think we're suffering right now, is lack of personal relationships. And I don't mean personal in that you're going to say yes no matter what because you know me. I mean in that this person's on the up and up. When they submit something, you can trust what they're submitting. Those types of relationships. Additionally, it's a calendar year for us and for most private sector folks, but we run on a different fiscal year than government. And government's fiscal year starts October 1st through September 30th. So depending on when you submit applications, you're going to hit right up against holiday schedules. Well, they take off holiday time. You're going to hit up against planning for budget and workshops. They're not doing your work then. So it's a matter of when are you submitting and what are your expectations? Do you have any kind of relationship with the people that you are, interacting with? If you don't, does your engineer? If your engineer doesn't, does your attorney? If they don't, are they willing to go work at it?
And build those
relationships. So I think it's a combination of all those things. Some of the jurisdictions are understaffed. If you look on job openings, there are more job openings in local jurisdictions than there have been in quite a while. So it's not that they're not funding them, it's that nobody's filling them. Or if they're getting filled, then in a month or two, they're off to another jurisdiction and you lost that person who you just trained. So it's a combination of all the worst things happening at once. But I really believe that a strong collective team and good relationships goes a whole lot further.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit about, we work in Florida where we have underlying land use within the state. Some states do, some states don't. Some states are trying to get there. But we also have zoning at the local municipal level, whether that's a city. Some counties also have zoning on top of land use. When we have instances where you have differing land use and zoning, what does that process look like? Is it better? I've always viewed land use as kind of the gold standard, or you'd prefer to have land use in place, and the zoning, for various reasons might not match the underlying land use. Maybe a landowner has owned that property for 30 or 40 years and it's been ag and they haven't changed the land use, or they haven't changed the zoning to match the land use, or vice versa. Talk a little bit about those situations in Florida where you do have mismatched land use and zoning, and is there one that you would rather have and one that's easier to get based on what you have?
Well, in most jurisdictions, there are both. In most jurisdictions, it's a land use, which is the underlying kind of ruling descriptor of the particular land, and then a subset or a more definitive description of the property would be zoning. Your land use will dictate what types of zoning you can have. It's not the other way around. So the more flexible, the more generous the underlying land use is, the more opportunity you have when seeking zoning because you have more options to pick from.
So if you have, let's say you have residential, low density residential land use, that would open the door to 2 or 3 different types of potential zonings within a residential
correct.
zoning, up to a certain, you
Yes.
have RL1, RL3, RL5,
Right.
or something like that within that land use. So that the city or county with the zoning takes their zoning code and matches it up with the county's or the state's land use and says, okay, based on this land use, here's the 3 or 4 different potential options for what the zoning could be.
Well, the
essence.
county has its own land use too, so it's not the state that sets the land use.
I should say the county land use that
Yeah.
they've submitted to the
Right.
state over the years. Yeah.
So they have to simply align and be compatible. And if you're going for something that's outside of the choices that you gave as an example, you want something with a higher density, then that will result in you having to go for a land use change. And how successful you'll be in getting that land use change oftentimes has to do with what's around you. What's going on around you? Because that's the first question asked, right? When you're doing a land use change is what I'm asking for compatible with the surrounding uses, yes or no? And if you can't get over that first hurdle, then you're not going to get on to the second. So it's oftentimes a challenge for ag properties to be rezoned for anything or land use changes because oftentimes they're surrounded by other ag land.
Gotcha.
So your argument to support your ask is sometimes difficult and challenging to make.
A lack of justification for the request.
Yes.
So from that, when we talk a little bit about zoning and land use on a deal perspective within real estate, oftentimes we have our typical process is we represent a seller. The seller wants to sell their property. They know it's a development piece of land. Let's say we take it to market. We say, okay, this could be X, Y, and Z, or it has land use in place for X, Y, and Z. Maybe the zoning's not there. Maybe it's just ag land use that somebody has to come in and change. Typically, then we contract with a buyer developer, and typically they want time to go get the land use and zoning changed before they close on a deal. What are some challenges with that structure? I mean, that's by far the most common situation because a developer doesn't want to close until they know they can do what they want to do. A seller typically wants more money than what they want to get the development value for it instead of just the ag value. But there's got to be pitfalls along the way where there's been instances probably, and we've seen them too, where a developer doesn't close after land use is changed, or there's just issues that a developer does something wrong or the economy changes and they wind up not doing the deal, but it's either already been approved for the new zoning or it's going that direction. What are some good best practices you can tell us as land brokers, but also landowners when thinking through those timelines and how to structure some of these deals?
I think that as the seller, you need to ensure that the buyer provides you regular updates during that due diligence period. So it usually goes, have 180 days or 120 days to do your due diligence, which would include obtaining governmental approvals, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. But if you, as the seller, aren't checking in on all of that, and you are making an assumption that I guess they're doing what they need to do, how will you know? Because if they wait till the very end, and we've just had the conversation, it takes so long to get through the governmental process, why is it taking so long? Then that ought to tell you that you ought to be dogging that. The seller should be giving the buyer should be giving the seller regular updates.
Is that copies of packages that were submitted?
Absolutely.
Updates on when meetings are, things like that?
In some instances, when we've represented the seller, we oftentimes put into the contract that the seller's representative will be invited to any meeting with any of the county jurisdiction or, any of the divisions, et cetera, any of the pre-app meetings. They don't have to hold up the meeting if we can't make it, but rather we're invited. We know it's happening.
The calendar.
That's
and making
right.
sure that the buyer's
Yes.
doing what they said they were
That's
doing.
right. And if we don't go to the meeting that we wanted to be invited to, then we know that we can call the county or the city or whatever after that meeting took place and say, how did it go?
Yep. Send us the notes,
That's
staff
right.
notes or whatever.
That's right. Because now you're keeping it in play. You're not waiting for that 30th day, that 120th day. You're not waiting till the very end when you get the request back from the buyer for an extension.
For more time.
That's right. And if they are asking for more time, if you followed along, you're saying, it's legit. They really do need it.
They're doing everything they need to do
That's
to
right.
get this property approved, and it's just there's some challenges we didn't know about, or it's just taking longer than we thought, but at least you're in the loop. And it seems like to me, sellers are much more comfortable working with buyers when they need more time if they've been informed on everything going on.
Right. And if they're the long time landowner of that property for generations or decades, as you said, they may know the local officials better than that buyer.
That's right.
And having them in attendance, if everybody's working off of the same sheet of music for the same goal, will be beneficial.
Yeah, have you seen situations like that? I've thought about that before, where it's, out of state, out of town developer coming in, but you've got local generational landowner, influential family in town. I feel like developers and buyers don't leverage that relationship enough, or at least as much as they could when trying to get things approved.
I agree. I don't think they do. Yet others do. Others are pretty savvy. I'm working with a group of folks that hired all local people and have been very successful in getting their projects through the approval process. And I think in part, a main part is because they used the local engineer.
Yeah.
And one of the folks working for the local engineering firm used to work for the local planning board. So they did their homework when they put their team together.
Yeah. And that would be your advice to buyer developers as well, especially those out of market, that they choose local service providers from an engineering perspective, surveying perspective, ecological and environmental perspective, land use attorney perspective, things like that.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. The deals that I can think of where something did not happen the way it should have were oftentimes because people didn't use service providers that had those relationships, kind of knew how to navigate. It was more just trying to ram a project through, and that's when people, show up with their pitchforks and aren't on board with a project. Whether that's,
and that can happen anyway.
yeah, true.
But
true,
again,
true.
The more work you do to have staff support your project, and the more work you do to have the local official that's over that particular property area to be supportive, then things fall into place more than they don't.
Right.
There's never a guarantee.
But more likely chance of something.
Yes. You have a
getting
better
approved.
chance of a yes than you.
And maintaining
otherwise.
relationships throughout it.
Right.
Yeah. So we believe firmly in private property rights, right? I mean, we want the landowner to be able to do what they want to do, and that layered on with zoning and land use can create challenges, of course, and issues. If you're a landowner going in wanting to develop on your property or wanting to do some, X, Y, and Z on it, people often don't react well to a government telling them what they can and cannot do on their own land. How far can that go? Let's say you go in for a land use change and it doesn't get approved, or a zoning change and it doesn't get approved for whatever use. What are the options available to a landowner at that point? Do they have any? Are there any repercussions that they could, what are the repercussions of that? Are there alternative options that they could pursue to get something approved? And have you seen situations where lawsuits and things like that arise out of a denied application for a zoning change, and kind of how do those things get resolved?
Yes, I've seen lawsuits. They're not as numerous as you might expect them to be, and I think that's because the cost that's involved is pretty hefty, and you're not guaranteed of the outcome. However, in most of the instances that I'm aware of where developers have pursued an answer through the court, it's been because staff has recommended the change for zoning. Staff has recommended the change to the comp plan, and they get up through the point where they're before the governing board, whether it's the commission or the council, and they're making their decision not based on those factual packets of information and applications where all the boxes were indeed checked, but rather in response to their constituents. And that's usually the trigger for the potential lawsuit. It's because the reasoning isn't supported by the documents reviewed and approved. So, but short of that, you're only entitled to your current land uses and the zoning that is applicable for that underlying land use. So if you're going to pursue something different, but what you're pursuing is a zoning change only, your land use is as is. And if the zoning you're pursuing is one of the allowable zoning districts for that underlying land use, you also have a pretty good argument of, you want to tell me why I can't do this, please?
Right. This is in your code.
This matches. So, why aren't we doing this? But again, getting the at least staff review to because we have some jurisdictions now where staff is not recommending for approval or to deny. They are simply stating the facts, nothing but the facts.
Right.
And they allow then no recommendation goes forward, and it's simply the Board of County Commissioners or the City Council making a decision based on the staff's report, but not provided a recommendation. It still goes back to if the staff report summarizes that the applicant has done everything they were supposed to do and that the requested change is compatible with the underlying land use, then it's a harder argument for that governing board, to make sorry, no as the answer. Because when the staff's looking for those things, they've already asked you for a transportation study. They've already asked you for confirmation from the school district. They've already asked for utilities. You're submitting all of that.
Mm-hmm.
You had to go to the utilities ahead of time before you got to this point. You had to go to the school board ahead of time before you got to this point. You had to have a traffic engineer do a preliminary study. So you're giving the information that would cause the most questions. And if all those questions are answered in your favor, then it's a difficult position that the governing board is in if they don't say yes.
Gotcha. That all makes sense. And I think that's, it seems like kind of one of the big takeaways from this is the more work and relationships and emphasis that is put on things up front and the front part of this process, the better things turn out on the back end.
Right.
So real quick, we've got a couple more minutes. I want to ask you two kind of just bigger picture questions. We've talked a lot about Florida. Our firm is based in Florida. We have now offices in Georgia, and we just opened one in Northwest Arkansas, which both of those places, Georgia has exploded in population growth, spillover from Florida, people moving down, same story as here. So is Northwest Arkansas. It's going to double in population in the next 20 years by every study and metric there because of the big job employers that are there. But these two places are probably experiencing some of what Florida experienced decades ago with, how do we plan out and manage this and navigate, this influx of people, and how do we maintain who we are as a geography, as a culture, things like that come along with it, but still approve projects and want to grow as an economy. Just big picture, what has Florida done well in that over the years? And then what are some of those suggestions or takeaways that you could see other places that are starting to get a lot of that development pressure? What could they do to navigate this successfully moving forward?
I think something that Florida has done well, at least in certain jurisdictions, is I think that the code of ordinances and their land development code has been comprehensive. Certainly in the larger jurisdictions, some of the more rural counties are just coming to terms with the fact that people are coming here now. I guess we better get a move on.
That's right. Trying to catch up.
They're trying to catch up. Yeah. But for those that have code in place, it's pretty substantial. So I think that's a good thing. I think what could they do better? I think the folks that sit on the quasi-judicial boards should follow the code.
It's there for a reason.
Yep. And they pay all of these experts, some of them very, very, very good, all this money to sift through all the data and to give them their professional opinion, just to pitch it out because politically it's easier to say no. I think that's the wrong way to do this.
Completely agree. And on that political pressure, the last thing we want to talk about is we have an election coming up at the national level. We have state and local elections coming up as well. From a public policy standpoint, land use zoning perspective, what can that do to projects that people are about to pursue? What can that do from existing projects that are in the pipeline? If there are changes within certain boards or commissioner level positions, what impact does that have for you from a land use perspective, and then us from a real estate perspective? What can we do to follow this, to make sure that we're staying on top of how different groups might lean in terms of their view of projects?
So I think for land use, the local elections are more important than the state or federal elections. I'm not saying that those elections aren't
Correct.
important.
100%. You're 100% right.
I'm just saying from a land use perspective. So understanding what each candidate, once you peel back the onion, where do they sit on those sorts of things? What do they do for a living? Have they ever been in business? Have they not? What have they done in the area of where they're running to substantiate the positions that they're taking? Is it just a whim? Are they a career politician? Because there's good, bad, and ugly. And I guess you have to pick your poison. But I think starting at the local level, paying attention to the candidates there, and looking for ways to help educate them so that they're speaking. That doesn't mean influence with money, in my opinion. That means help them understand what they don't understand.
Absolutely. And that falls on us as real estate professionals, us as community too, to make sure they understand some of how we look at projects, or we look at metrics on certain locations and what could go in some of these properties as people weigh, both at the city level and county level, and from a landowner perspective, what's feasible, what's reality for some of these projects, and what do we need? Where do we fall short? So,
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Anna. Quickly, tell us a little bit more about how people can contact you, where they can find your work, and a little bit about Dean Mead. We have a great relationship with your firm here at our company. We're proud to work with you all as much as we do, and appreciative of all your sponsorship and involvement on panels and podcasts and things like that of some of our events.
Well, thank you. I work about 50% of my time out of our Orlando office, and then another 50% of my time out of our Melbourne Viera office. We have about 60 attorneys located throughout our offices, including Fort Pierce, Vero. What am I missing? Naples. And I think that we have a great group of professionals, not only our attorneys, our paralegals, our administrative staff. They're all top notch. I've worked at other firms, some smaller, some larger. I've worked for local government. And it's just a very good place to be, because we have a depth of knowledge and service, and we are really committed to trying to find a solution for the client. Not always one they want, but I think we're pretty candid about what we can and cannot do. So
That's awesome. And we thank you so much for your time. We thank you so much for your involvement and support of our firm. If you do have questions for Anna, we'll put her contact information in the show notes, and feel free to reach out to me as well, and we can connect you with her. So until next time, Anna, thank you so much.
thank you.
Thank you for listening to In Our Expert Opinion Real Estate Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss any of our upcoming episodes. For more on land and commercial real estate, please connect with us at saundersrealestate.com.